In Babylon, there was a law that said this: if you owed someone money and couldn't pay, you could hand over your wife or your child to work off the debt. That part sounds exactly like what you'd expect from the ancient world. Here's the part that doesn't fit. The law also said exactly how long that arrangement was allowed to last: 3 years. Not a lifetime. Not until the master decides. 3 years then, the debt was legally considered paid, whether the creditor liked it or not. So the honest answer to the question in the title is yes, regularly, on a schedule, sometimes for entire populations at once. That doesn't make it a good system, it makes it a stranger one than most people assume. Let's start with how someone actually became a slave in the first place, because the answer isn't what you'd guess. Most people assume war. Conquer a city, take the survivors, put them to work. That did happen, but the records tell a different story about where most enslaved people actually came from. Study after study of contracts from this period turns up very little evidence of mass war captive slavery being sold as property. Prisoners of war were more often ransomed. A family, a temple, or the state back home would pay to get them back, because a live prisoner with a price on his head was worth more to everyone than a dead one, or a permanently owned one. The far more common route into slavery was much smaller, much quieter, and much more common than any battlefield. Debt. Picture an ordinary farmer. A bad harvest. A loan he can't repay. Under the law, he has an option. Hand over a family member, his wife, his child, sometimes himself, to the lender to work off what he owes. This wasn't rare. This wasn't an edge case buried in the law code. This was one of the main functions the entire legal system was built to manage. Mesopotamian society had an entire vocabulary for this, an entire bureaucracy of contracts, witnesses, and clay tablets recording exactly who owed what, to whom, and for how long. And once someone entered this kind of bondage, the legal categories got complicated fast. Babylonian law actually recognized 3 tiers of people. The Awalu, free citizens with full rights. The Muskanu, free but with fewer privileges, often landless. And the Wardu, the slave. A slave in this system could legally own property, could hold slaves of his own, could marry a free woman, in which case any children were born free, could, in some documented cases, buy his own freedom outright, or be formally adopted into a household and released from bondage entirely. None of that makes the arrangement fair, but it does mean the picture in your head, permanent, total, generational bondage with 0 legal standing, isn't the full picture. This was a system with actual internal exits. Now the part that actually answers the question. Hammurabi's code lays out the debt bondage arrangement with a specific, hard number attached: 3 years. After 3 years of labor, the debt is considered settled. The person goes free. This wasn't a suggestion. It was written into the same law code that also says a builder whose house collapses and kills the owner should be put to death. This was a real, functioning legal limit, sitting in the same document as some of the harshest punishments in the ancient world. If the person handed over was a woman who had borne the creditor's children during that time, the law added an extra protection. She had to be freed regardless once the underlying debt was paid off, no exceptions written in for that case. The law even specified that if the debt had been settled by selling her outright to a merchant, the original owner had to repay the merchant and free her anyway. So for a large share of people entering bondage in Babylon, freedom wasn't a matter of hoping for mercy. It was a matter of counting down a legal clock that the state itself enforced. But the real twist isn't the 3-year rule, it's what happened above it, at the level of the entire kingdom. Because debt didn't just create individual slaves. At scale, across an entire population, it created a much bigger problem. Over time, wealthy creditors would accumulate more and more land, more and more debt-bonded labor, until a huge share of the population owed something to a small number of people at the top. That's a serious problem for a king and not for sentimental reasons. Fewer free farmers means fewer men available for the army. Fewer taxable households. A kingdom slowly draining itself from the middle out, with wealth pooling upward while the base that actually paid for everything eroded. So kings did something that sounds almost unbelievable for this period of history. They canceled the debt. All of it. At once. Across the entire kingdom in a single royal decree. These proclamations had different names depending on the city and the era. Amargi, in the city of Lagash. Nigsisa, in Ur. Andorarum, under the Assyrians. Misharum, in Babylon itself. Whatever the name, the effect was the same. Every qualifying debt across the kingdom, wiped clean in a single decree. Land that had been seized for unpaid debts returned to its original owners. Debt slaves, freed on the spot, regardless of how long they'd already served or how much of the 3 years remained. This wasn't a one-time act of mercy from an unusually generous ruler. The earliest documented example comes from the city of Lagash, around 2400 BC. That's 600 years before Hammurabi was even born. And it kept happening, generation after generation. Historians have identified roughly 30 of these general debt cancellations across Mesopotamia between 2400 and 1400 BC. Many kings issued one automatically upon taking the throne, almost as a coronation ritual. Others issued them in response to a bad harvest, a war, or an outbreak of disease. A kind of emergency economic reset button built into how these societies expected kingship to function. An entire legal system for enslaving people over debt, sitting right next to a separate, well-established, centuries-old tradition for occasionally erasing that debt completely. It's worth being honest about what this wasn't. This wasn't emancipation as an idea, and nobody in Babylon was arguing that slavery itself was wrong. The debt cancellations weren't moral progress in the way we'd recognize it. They were maintenance, a way of resetting the system before it broke the kingdom that depended on it, protecting the king's tax base and army recruitment, not protecting people for their own sake. And slavery in the Bronze Age still meant exactly what you'd assume in its worst moments. People were bought, sold, and physically branded. A barber caught removing a slave's identifying mark without permission could have his own hands cut off, which tells you plainly how seriously that marking was treated as property, not as a person. In the worst years during famine, the law explicitly allowed parents to sell their own children, not as some rare horror story whispered about, but as a recognized, named, legally documented transaction with its own contract language. The system had an exit door, sometimes several. It also had every other door you'd expect a system built on human bondage to have, including the darkest ones. So, did Bronze Age slaves ever go free? Yes, constantly. Some through purchase, some through adoption, some through a fixed 3-year clock written directly into the law and enforced by the same king who could also order a man's hands cut off for a lesser offense. And sometimes, all at once, when a ruler stood up and canceled every debt in the kingdom in a single afternoon, freeing people who had no idea it was coming. None of that erases what the system was for most of the people caught inside it, for most of their lives, for most of Bronze Age history. But it does mean the ancient world was already wrestling with a problem we still argue about today. What happens when debt outgrows the ability of ordinary people to ever climb back out of it, and what a society is willing to do, or not do, to fix that before it collapses? Their answer wasn't to end the practice that created the problem in the first place. It was to build in a reset button and pull it again and again for well over 1,000 years.